In 1970, a notorious counterculture prank unfolded at the White House. Grace Slick, the electrifying lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, arrived at a presidential tea party with 600 micrograms of LSD hidden in her pocket, and she was quietly plotting to slip it into President Richard Nixon's teacup. It was a caper befitting a woman whose life would be defined by rebellion. Grace became one of the top voices of 1960s psychedelic rock, and she was best known for her searing vocals on hits like Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, and notorious for living as wildly as the lyrics she sang. Across a career marked by scandal, controversy, and transformative art, Grace Slick blazed a trail through the highs of fame and the lows of addiction. This is the extraordinary journey of rock's rebel queen, from society girl to acid rock legend. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Grace Slick was born as Grace Barnett Wing on October 30th, 1939, into what looked like a pretty ordinary upper-middle-class life. Her father was an investment banker, and her mother a homemaker, and she spent her childhood in Illinois and later in California suburbs. By her own account, nothing in that conventional 1950s upbringing explains the fire that was brewing inside her. A stable life had been mapped out for her, finishing school in New York, marriage, children, and no doubt a life of pies cooling in a tidy, well-appointed kitchen. Young Grace tried to play along at first. She attended Finch College in New York, which really was a proper finishing school for young ladies. But the conformity of it suffocated her. Don't offend anybody, dress a certain way, get married, have children. She had later scoffed at the expectations placed on 1950s women. Her reaction, and that of many women she knew, was a resounding, "Don't think so." The prim and proper life would not be Grace's destiny. By the early 1960s, Grace had returned to California and married her childhood friend Gerald "Jerry" Slick in 1961. She briefly found work as a fashion model in San Francisco, but the role felt rather empty to her. Too many clothing changes, too much judgment by clients, and not enough art, she said of those days. In 1965, everything changed when Grace read a news report in the San Francisco Chronicle about an emergent local rock band called Jefferson Airplane. The article opened a door to a new world. Whatever Jefferson Airplane and the city's burgeoning hippie music scene were up to, Grace wanted in. Fired up by this calling, Grace and her husband Jerry decided to form their own band in 1965. With Jerry on drums and Grace singing and playing guitar, they pulled in Jerry's brother Darby Slick on guitar and named the group The Great Society, which was a satirical jab at President Johnson's grand social programs. Grace started writing songs, and she channeled her simmering frustrations into music with sharper edges than the polite pop tunes of the day. One of the first songs she wrote was a swirling, surreal piece inspired by Alice in Wonderland, a number of course called White Rabbit. Another, Somebody to Love, was written by Darby Slick. The Great Society performed these originals around San Francisco's clubs, and they had found a folk rock sound with quite the psychedelic bite. Grace's low and forceful voice immediately set her apart. She wasn't a demure crooner in a gown, she was a raven-haired firebrand who could wail and roar. "I was singing with the force and anger that women were afraid to express at the time," she later said, noting that her fury was directed not at men, but, quote, "at conformity and the rules that applied only to us." Grace Slick's voice was a kind of herald for a new type of female empowerment on stage, unrestrained and wild. Grace's big break arrived in October 1966. Jefferson Airplane, the very band whose rise had inspired her in the first place, came knocking with an offer. The Airplane's original female vocalist, Signe Tolley Anderson, had decided to leave the band to start a family. Grace was at a Jefferson Airplane rehearsal, by some accounts, watching from the balcony, when bassist Jack Cassidy approached and asked if she'd like to join the group. With that invitation, Grace Slick jumped from local aspiring singer to frontwoman of one of San Francisco's hottest bands. Suddenly, the housewife turned rocker had a seat on the airplane. Grace brought along two secret weapons: the songs Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, which the Airplane eagerly added to their repertoire. In early 1967, the band recorded Surrealistic Pillow, their landmark second album, and Grace's first with them. Its release would make rock history. Somebody to Love was delivered as a thrilling duet between Grace and Airplane founder Paul Kantner. It became the album's breakout hit. What had been a jangly folk tune with great society was transformed by Jefferson Airplane into a terrifying psych rock stomper, all fury and desperation. By the spring of 1967, Somebody to Love was blasting out of radios nationwide, eventually peaking at number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Listeners were mesmerized by Grace's urgent alto, which demanded of them, "Don't you want somebody to love?" Her voice was somehow both seductive and utterly scathing. Then there was White Rabbit. Clocking in at just 2.5 minutes, this hypnotic track was unlike anything else on the airwaves. Over a slinky Spanish-inflected march, inspired by Ravel's Bolero and Miles Davis's sketches of Spain, Grace intoned lyrics that came right from Lewis Carroll's surreal children's tale. But White Rabbit was deeply subversive. Its references to one pill makes you larger, one pill makes you small, were barely disguised allusions to psychedelic drugs. It was rock and roll, but not as anyone had heard it before. Indeed, White Rabbit snuck this overt drug imagery past censors by couching it in this Wonderland whimsy. People kept saying, "Why do you young people use these chemicals now?" Grace said, recalling the generational bewilderment. "Well, didn't you notice the stories you were reading to us? Alice takes at least 5 different drugs in that book. Even Snow White was knocked out by some kind of chemical," she said. With White Rabbit, Grace turned the establishment's own fairy tales into an ode to mind expansion. The song soared to number 8 on the charts in the summer of 1967, and it became a defining psychedelic anthem of the summer of love. Virtually overnight, Grace Slick became the symbol of San Francisco's hippie counterculture. The band's lineup, Grace alongside co-lead singer Marty Balin, guitarist Paul Kantner, lead guitarist Jorma Kaukonen, bassist Jack Cassidy, and drummer Spencer Dryden, was now complete, and the timing was perfect. The year 1967 saw an explosion of the hippie movement, and Jefferson Airplane was at its epicenter. Grace's vocals gave the Airplane a visceral edge. One critic described the voice as utterly captivating, the sound of an era unraveling when peace-loving hippie platitudes spun off towards something darker and more foreboding. On stage, with her dark hair, fierce stare and go-go boots, Grace had a charismatic and bohemian cool. She was the rare woman who could hold her own in a scene dominated by men, while still giving off both sex appeal and intimidating coolness. In the summer of 1967, they performed at the Monterey International Pop Festival, which was, of course, one of the first major rock festivals, alongside the likes of Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. That August, the Airplane's image, with Grace front and center, graced, pun intended, the cover of Life magazine. The new youth culture was gaining mainstream visibility, although this would also be its inevitable downfall. But for now, Grace's transformation from debutante to psychedelic royalty was complete. Grace leaned fully into her new role as a counterculture icon. In other words, she was raising hell. Perhaps more than any other member of the band, Grace was up for pushing boundaries. For one, she literally made broadcasting history by becoming the first person to say "motherfucker" on American television. The incident occurred during a 1969 appearance on the Dick Cavett Show. when Jefferson Airplane performed their volatile protest song We Can Be Together. The song's lyrics included the revolutionary rallying cry, "Up against the wall, motherfucker," and Grace sang it on live TV with no little abandon. Somehow the naughty words slipped past the network's censors, and it startled viewers and executives alike. Grace later said that rock musicians don't know anything about anything except having fun, how much money we can spend and who we can screw. And on that day, having fun meant dropping the MF bomb on television decorum. On stage, Grace was just as uninhibited. One famous moment came at dawn on August 17, 1969, when Jefferson Airplane played the Woodstock Festival. Thanks to weather delays, the airplane didn't go on until 8 a.m., performing to a soggy, half-asleep crowd that had been up all night. Grace seized the moment and made sure that this bizarrely timed performance would be mind-blowing. Stepping to the mic in the early morning light, she proclaimed, "All right, friends, you have seen the heavy groups. Now you will see morning maniac music. Believe me, yeah, it's a new dawn." With that, she launched into a 2-hour set, including blistering versions of Somebody to Love, and appropriately a bleary-eyed encore of White Rabbit for the weary, heavily tripping Woodstock masses. Her announcement of a new dawn became one of Woodstock's legendary quotes, and a reference to the fact that the age of Aquarius had literally stretched past sunrise. During these heady late 60s years, Grace truly lived the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle. She rubbed elbows and more with her fellow rock luminaries. One wild tale from her 1960s adventures involves Jim Morrison, the enigmatic lead singer of The Doors. The airplane and The Doors often crossed paths, and they shared concert bills and late-night parties. Grace recalled one encounter when Morrison was so deep in an acid trip that he dropped to all fours and howled at the moon like an animal. Sometime later, Grace decided to visit Morrison's hotel room, just to see what might happen between her and the very desirable Morrison. What followed was a psychedelic night of sex that she described in characteristically vivid language. Sleeping with Jim Morrison, Grace wrote, was like making love to a floating art form with eyes. As surreal and intense as one might expect from two avatars of the psychedelic scene. He was a well-built boy, she added with a raspy laugh. His cock was slightly larger than average. So there you have it. If you ever wondered how well endowed Jim Morrison was, you have it from the horse's mouth. Morrison never did call her again. Apparently I wasn't his style, she joked. But she didn't mind. In those days, she was sampling life's pleasures freely. By her own admission, Grace was very friendly with that band, meaning Jefferson Airplane, and not just in the musical sense. She had affairs with nearly all her bandmates at one time or another. I was friendly with everybody in the band except Marty Balin, she later cracked. But if he had come on to me, I would have gone for Marty too. Balin, however, later said he would have run a mile if she had tried to seduce him. Monogamy was hardly a priority amid the free love ethos of the late 60s. Slick and her cohorts indulged in drugs, dallied in casual sex, and waved goodbye to traditional morality, living out exactly the kind of degeneracy that alarmed their parents' generation. A generation which, in fairness, had dragged the world into World War II. It was little wonder the children born during that war weren't listening to the old ways anymore. Grace's irreverence was often laced with sharp social commentary. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the infamous White House incident of 1970. As mentioned in the introduction, she had been invited, under her maiden name, Grace Wing, to a high society tea at the Nixon White House. Seeing an opportunity for mischief, she teamed up with yippie revolutionary Abby Hoffman and plotted to dose the president. On April the 24th, 1970, the pair arrived at the White House gates, Grace with a stash of LSD tucked under a long fingernail, more than enough to send Tricky Dick on quite a technicolor trip down the rabbit hole. The plan was simple and absurd. During polite conversation, Slick would slyly flick the LSD into Nixon's teacup. But Secret Service agents got wind of who Grace Wing really was just in time. As Grace and Hoffman attempted to enter, guards stopped them cold. It's a women-only event, she was told, meaning Hoffman would have to wait outside. Grace decided not to abandon Abby, who promptly hung a banner bearing a marijuana leaf on the front gate. The two long-haired interlopers were promptly escorted off White House grounds, their mission unaccomplished. Nixon never drank the electric Kool-Aid that day, and in fact, he hadn't even planned to attend his daughter's tea. But the audacity of Slick's attempt cemented her legend. It was also pretty much a perfect snapshot of the era's culture clash. A rebel rock star nearly infiltrating the halls of power, with nothing more than an old college invitation and a pocket full of acid. By the end of 1969, Jefferson Airplane had ridden the psychedelic wave to its crest. They had played all the era's iconic events: Monterey Pop in '67, Woodstock in '69, and even the ill-fated and bloody Altamont Speedway free concert in December 1969. The Altamont show, organised by the Rolling Stones and marred by violence, in some ways marked the dark close of the '60s peace and love chapter. Jefferson Airplane's set at Altamont was chaotic. The Hells Angels biker gang, hired as security, had been drinking heavily, and partway through the airplane's performance, things turned ugly. A Hells Angel punched Marty Ballin in the face, knocking him unconscious on the side of the stage. The vibes were bad, Slick later said of Altamont. Something was very peculiar, hazy, abrasive, and unsure. Amid the scuffling, Grace tried to calm the crowd. Easy, easy, she implored from the mic. Everyone just cool out. Footage shows her attempting to de-escalate the tension. But the mayhem only grew. Denise Dukes, the heavily pregnant singer of the Ace of Cups, was hit in the head with a beer bottle thrown by the crowd and suffered a fractured skull. Then, snappily dressed young fan, Meredith Hunter, was stabbed and killed by a Hells Angel during the Rolling Stones set later that day after pulling a gun and trying to get to the stage. The airplane, shaken by Ballin's beating, had left the scene by helicopter before the stabbing occurred. But they'd seen enough. Altamont was a grim bookend to the utopian hopes of Woodstock just 4 months earlier. If Jesus had been there, he would have been crucified, Mick Jagger would say of that day. For Grace Slick and her band, it was further proof that a high of the 1960s was giving way to a hangover. As the 1970s dawned, Jefferson Airplane began to fracture under the weight of the era's various pressures, which included fighting in the band, drug abuse, and changing musical tides. In January 1971, Grace gave birth to a daughter, China Wing Kantner, fathered by her bandmate and then lover Paul Kantner. Grace was determined not to let motherhood clip her wings, though. She brought baby China on tour, and she raised her child amid guitars, amplifiers, and haze-filled arenas. Remarkably, it worked out. By Grace's account, China grew into an amazing person, with a nasty sense of humour, just like her mum's. China Kantner would later have a career as an actress, an MTV VJ, and today works as a chaplain. But raising an infant on the road was no easy feat, and it came amidst major turmoil within Jefferson Airplane. The band's lineup was changing. Singer Marty Ballin drifted away in 1971. Drummer Spencer Dryden had been fired in 1970. Inter-band romances and breakups complicated things. Grace and Paul Kantner's relationship was loving but certainly non-traditional. And Grace had also had a brief fling with lead guitarist Jorma Kaukonen. I was seeing Kaukonen for some time, she admitted. If you look into the great loves of her life, they almost all seem to have one thing in common: being in a band, as one writer observed. Jerry Slick, her first husband, Jack Cassidy, Spencer Dryden, Paul Kantner, all at some point were Grace's partners or paramours. Amid all this, Jefferson Airplane released their swan song album, Volunteers, and attempted a couple more years of touring. But by 1972, the airplane was in a tailspin. The counterculture was changing, and so were the musicians. Grace increasingly turned to alcohol for a means of support, with predictably disastrous results. At first, it was the usual rock and roll indulgence, but over time, her bandmates grew alarmed. She's such a beautiful person when she's sober, but it's like an instant change when she was drunk, recalled Pete Sears, the bassist who worked with Grace in the mid-70s. When she gets drunk, the evil forces seem to be able to take over. There's like a demon looking at you or something. The party was getting out of hand, and Grace's antics were no longer charmingly rebellious, but veering into self-destruction. Even so, Grace remained a magnetic frontwoman. And in 1974, she regrouped with Kantner and other airplane alumni to form Jefferson Starship, a new band rising, as they put it, from the ashes of Jefferson Airplane. The airplane was grounded, but the Starship was ready for launch. This new outfit had a more radio-friendly rock sound, in step with the mellowed-out mid-1970s. They scored soft rock hits like Miracles, sung by Marty Balin, who rejoined for a time, and were a huge commercial success. But behind the scenes, Grace's drinking was getting seriously out of control. On tour, she became unpredictable. She'd slur her words on stage, taunt audiences, sometimes forget lyrics. Offstage was even worse. Grace developed a dangerous habit of drunk driving. In one harrowing incident in 1971, she challenged Jorma Kaukonen to a drag race on the road approaching the Golden Gate Bridge. Barreling along San Francisco's Doyle Drive at 80 miles per hour, her car hit a patch of oil and spun out of control. Grace's vehicle smashed into a concrete wall at high speed. Very stupid of me, she admitted of that near-fatal joyride. That road was known as Deadly Doyle Drive for a reason. When you hit that grease, you start sliding. Miraculously, Grace survived with minor injuries. I was lucky, she said later, marveling that the concrete barrier suffered more damage than she did. But the crash was a sobering warning, literally, that her luck might run out. For a while, Grace tried to rein herself in. She married Skip Johnson, Jefferson Starship's lighting designer, in 1976, and outwardly seemed to embrace a steadier life. But her alcoholism continued to shadow her. The breaking point came during Jefferson Starship's 1978 European tour, a debacle that has become rock legend. In Germany for a show, Grace arrived on stage obliterated drunk, far too intoxicated to perform her songs. Frustrated German fans began booing and throwing things. In response, Grace snapped. She taunted the crowd by mocking Germany's Nazi past, reportedly shouting, "Who won the war?" and giving Hitler salutes while cackling at the audience. At one point, she stuck her fingers up the nostrils of a fan near the stage and jeered at others as Nazis. Pandemonium ensued, angry concert-goers rioted, burning the stage and equipment after the band fled the scene. Mortified and enraged, the band cancelled the next day's show, but Grace wasn't finished. The following night in Hamburg, she outdid herself. After a heckler called her a cute little Swiss miss, because of her outfit, Grace vanished backstage, only to re-emerge wearing a Nazi uniform she'd somehow procured, and proceeded to perform a rather grotesque parody, a "get back at you for the Second World War" routine, as she later described it. It was an extraordinary spectacle, even by rock and roll standards. I wanted to be so out of line that when I fired myself the next day, nobody would object, Grace confessed of her self-sabotaging stunt. Funnily enough, her plan worked. Paul Kantner promptly asked her to leave the band the morning after the Hamburg incident. Grace had effectively fired herself from Jefferson Starship, ending the 70s in a haze of dumb, drunken decisions, her own words for that night, and public disgrace, all while dressed up as some kind of Nazi vixen from an exploitation film. Feeling soberly chastened by the debacle, Grace finally confronted her alcoholism. "I wanted the band to see an uncontrollable mutant," she said of her mindset in 1978. After being ousted, Slick went home to California and entered rehab, attempting to get sober for the first time in years. Jefferson's Starship continued without her. They hired a new singer and went on, but Grace's absence was short-lived. Remarkably, after getting clean for a spell, she was welcomed back into Jefferson's Starship in 1981. The band, maybe recognizing that Grace's star power was irreplaceable, forgave her transgressions. For Grace, it was a chance to redeem herself. "I was trying to make it up to the band, because I've been this wild drunk," she explained of her decision to return. She rejoined a sober woman, determined to be reliable and professional. Through the early 1980s, Grace Slick stayed true to that promise, remaining alcohol-free throughout the decade. Little did she know that this earnest sobriety would later be something she jokingly regretted. Clean and focused, Grace Slick entered the 1980s ready for a new chapter. By this point, Jefferson's Starship had evolved again. In 1984, co-founder Paul Kantner, the last link to the airplane era besides Grace, quit the group and took the rights to the Jefferson name with him. The remaining members, including Grace and vocalist Mickey Thomas, went ahead simply as Starship. In a musical twist no one could have predicted, this incarnation would, in fact, achieve the biggest commercial hits of Grace's entire career. The counterculture priestess of White Rabbit and The Summer of Love suddenly found herself topping the pop charts in the Reagan era. Starship's 1985 album, Knee Deep in the Hoopla, generated not one, but two #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. The synth rock anthem, We Built This City, and the power ballad, Sarah. For Grace, who shared lead vocals with Mickey Thomas, it was a strange second act. In November 1985, shortly after her 46th birthday, We Built This City hit #1, and it made Grace the oldest female vocalist ever to top the American charts at that time. She broke her own record just 2 years later when Starship's Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, from the 1987 film Mannequin, reached #1 in April 1987. Grace was 47. This record stood until Cher, at 52, scored a #1 with Believe in 1999. Grace's booming voice was all over MTV and radio, in heavy rotation alongside artists half her age. Ironically, the very fact of her success unsettled her. She felt uncomfortable being a middle-aged rock star in a youth-driven industry. Rock and roll, she claimed, was a young person's game. I was still in my mid to late 40s, but I felt uncomfortable up on stage singing in my 40s, she admitted. The grandma of psychedelic rock had become, almost accidentally, a queen of slick 80s pop, and she wasn't sure she liked it. More problematic from Grace's perspective was the music itself. Starship's glossy hits were a far cry from the acid rock jams of Jefferson Airplane. The new songs were mostly written by outside songwriters and producers, and they were aiming squarely for money. Grace made no secret of her disdain for some of these tunes. We Built This City, in particular, drew her ire. I thought it was ridiculous, she said flatly of the track that had given her a new #1. There isn't a city built on rock and roll. Los Angeles was built on oil and oranges and the movie business. She pointed out that the lyrics were penned by Bernie Taupin, Elton John's songwriting partner, an Englishman. He's British and London obviously isn't built on rock and roll. Stupid song. To her, these corporate pop rock anthems lacked the authenticity and creativity that had defined her earlier work. So why did she sing them? Grace answered with her trademark candor, duty, and a bit of penance. I kinda had to because I was trying to make it up to the band, she confessed. After the chaos she caused in the 70s, she felt she owed her bandmates professionalism. If that meant churning out cheesy hit songs soberly and reliably, so be it. And indeed, Slick stayed sober all through the 1980s to keep her promise. Night after night, while the rest of the rock world indulged in the excesses of the MTV era, Grace would pointedly sip tea on tour. But in classic Slick fashion, she later joked that this responsible behaviour might have been a miscalculation. I'd been this wild, crazy-ass drunk, so to make up for it, I was sober all through the 80s, which was a mistake, she said with a laugh. Despite her misgivings, the mid-80s gave Grace something few of her 60s peers enjoyed. A second round of fame and a fat bank account to show for it. Starship's success meant big tours, music videos, and royalties that presumably set her up for life. She gamely appeared in the MTV videos, memorably in Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. She belts into the camera from the back of a convertible, looking like a rock and roll auntie amid the neon and hairspray of the younger band members. If the visuals felt a tad age inappropriate, as she herself once put it, Slick put up with them with humour. Still, by the late 80s, she sensed it was time to bow out, as gracefully as her name demanded for once. She had long held the belief that rock stars over 50 should retire. All rock and rollers over the age of 50 look stupid and should retire, Grace said, famously and unapologetically. It was a stance that earned her some accusations of ageism, but she clarified that in her view, certain genres like jazz or blues could age well, whereas rock and roll is really a way for young people to get their anger out. Once that youthful fire dims, she argued, it's dignified to step aside. True to her word, Grace Slick decided to retire from performing in 1989, right after one final project, a Jefferson Airplane reunion. That year, the surviving classic lineup of Jefferson Airplane, Slick, Balin, Kantner, Cassidy, and Kaukonen, came together to record a self-titled reunion album and embark on a nostalgia tour. The reunion was a bittersweet epilogue. Audiences were excited to see the legendary band back together, and Grace, at 49, was in fine voice. But old frictions resurfaced, and the album received lukewarm reviews. Grace herself felt slightly out of place. She had one foot out the door of the rock world already. By tour's end, she was done. In September 1989, as the Jefferson Airplane tour concluded, Grace Slick walked off the concert stage for good, a few weeks shy of her 50th birthday. Retirement from music did not mean a quiet life for Grace Slick, at least not at first. The early 1990s were rather tumultuous, and they tested the legendary Hellraiser in new ways. Freed from the structure of touring and recording, Grace fell off the wagon after a long 1980s sobriety. By her own admission, she became a periodic drunk in those years, abstaining for stretches and then going on binges that landed her in trouble. One particularly dark night in March 1994, trouble came knocking, literally, and Grace answered with a shotgun in hand. The bizarre incident unfolded at Slick's hillside home in Tiburon, California. According to police reports, an intoxicated man, later identified as a friend of Grace's, called 911 in the wee hours, claiming a drunk woman was firing a gun in the house. When officers arrived around 3:30 a.m., they were greeted not by gunfire, but by Grace herself, who swung open the door, brandishing an unloaded shotgun. The 54-year-old rock legend, apparently in a belligerent haze, told the cops to get off her property and refused to drop the weapon. An officer seized the moment when her attention wavered and wrestled the shotgun away before anyone got hurt. Grace was arrested and charged with felony assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer. The news made headlines. The once high-flying Jefferson Airplane singer had hit a new low. In court, Grace was contrite. She received a 6-month suspended sentence and was ordered to attend a rehab program and perform community service. It was effectively a last warning. In the late 90s, she checked herself back into rehab, this time with a supportive and somewhat surprising companion. Her daughter China, by then in her mid-20s, visited her mother in rehab and decided to check herself in as well, to address her own issues with alcohol. Grace recalls the staff being shocked. 2 generations of slick women signing into treatment together. But it worked. They have both been sober ever since. Grace got a handle on the addiction that had shadowed her, on and off for decades. She, as always, found humour in her misdeeds once they were behind her, joking that her various arrests over the years were just what she called citations for talking under the influence. Still, she acknowledges the hard truth. I had to go to rehab to learn, look, you can't do this anymore because you turn into an arsehole, she said of her come-to-Jesus moment after waving that gun at a cop. The wild child of the 60s had learned her limits at last. Having closed the door on performing and partying, Grace was looking for new outlets for her creative energy. In the mid-1990s, she picked up a paintbrush and discovered a second career as a visual artist. It started casually. She sketched and painted at home as a hobby. But before long, Grace developed a distinctive body of artwork that drew on the rich iconography of her rock past. By the 2000s, she was exhibiting and selling her paintings in galleries. Fans who once collected her records now collected her prints. On her website and at shows, one could find vibrant paintings of white rabbits, naturally, scenes from Alice in Wonderland, psychedelic landscapes, and portraits of fellow rock icons. One series included a topless Jim Morrison rendered in colourful strokes. Another depicted the hookah-smoking caterpillar from Alice, and a trippy panorama of the Monterey Pop Festival with white rabbits hidden among the crowd. I paint the things that were part of the world I lived in, she told interviewers. In a way, Slick's art allowed her to reinterpret the 1960s on canvas. Painting, unsurprisingly, proved to be a healthier addiction than alcohol. Grace found herself sometimes painting for a couple of months straight, all day, all night, getting lost in the creative flow. Then she would take a break, recharge, and dive in again. By her own account, she couldn't fully stop making art if she tried. I can't stop. It's a habit that's harder to break than alcohol, she said with a laugh. In 1996, Jefferson Airplane was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition of the band's influence. Grace skipped the induction ceremony, ever consistent in her distaste for public pomp and still firm in her retirement. But the honor symbolized her lasting importance in music history. Life, of course, had more twists in store. In November 2018, a wildfire raged through Malibu, and it threatened Grace's home. She prepared to evacuate, but the winds shifted and spared her property. It was a close call that surely brought flashbacks of an earlier disaster. In 1993, a fire had destroyed Slick's house in Marin County, incinerating nearly all her belongings, including priceless music memorabilia from her airplane days. Magically, in the charred ruins, only one thing survived intact: a ceramic white rabbit figurine. Throughout her life, the spectre of the acid-soaked white rabbit, that creation of her youthful imagination, had followed her in song and art and gifts from fans. To see a porcelain rabbit endure literal flames when everything else was lost was almost poetic. Grace took it as a sign. She held onto that rabbit and continued painting them frequently. Today, Grace Slick is comfortably in her 80s, an age she once swore she'd never reach as a rock star. We all sort of expected to die at 30, she admits of her 1960s peers. Instead, she survived, outliving most of the wild ones from her generation. Now more a great-grandmother of the psychedelic era, she sounds as perky, full of mischief as ever. Despite house fires, near-fatal car crashes, run-ins with the law, and oceans of booze and drugs, Grace has emerged in her old age with her wit intact and her perspective lucid. She has outlived two of her former husbands. Jerry Slick passed in 2020, Skip Johnson in 2011, buried old bandmates and friends, and watched the world change in ways she couldn't have imagined in 1967. More than a half-century after she first asked the world for somebody to love, Grace Slick has found plenty. Fans who adore her, a daughter and family who ground her, and an enduring respect from the music community. She also found the ability to love herself enough to climb out of addiction and cultivate a peaceful, creative life. In true Slick fashion, however, she'll be the first to puncture any sentimentality. "I can't believe I'm still here," she said. Yet here she is, the rebel queen of acid rock, still painting new wonders and flouting convention in whatever way she can. That's all I've got for you on the marvellous Grace Slick. If you made it this far, why not leave me a comment about your favourite song of hers? Also, have a look at the new members area by clicking the join button below the video. And don't forget to have a look at Hollywood Mysteries too. More of the same over there. I've been Chester. See you in the next one. Cheers.